My son sold my car while I was at work. At 75, you shouldn't be driving, and kept the $35,000 for himself. He didn't know that in the glove compartment was an envelope with $50,000 cash. When the new owner found it and called me, I told him, "Keep it, but do me one favor." Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always assumed that 75 meant slowing down. I never got that memo. My name is Margaret Elaine Holloway, and until the spring of 2 years ago, I had lived alone in the same pale yellow house in Dayton, Ohio, for 31 years. The hydrangeas along the front porch were mine. The vegetable garden in the back, carrots, tomatoes, one stubborn row of beets, was mine. And the silver 2019 Buick Enclave parked in the driveway every evening at 5:45 was mine. Every single thing I had earned, maintained, and paid for myself. My late husband, Gerald, understood that about me. He used to say, "Maggie, you'd argue with gravity if it slowed you down." He wasn't wrong. I worked 3 days a week as a bookkeeper for a small dental practice on Wilmington Avenue. Dr. Patricia Hess had been my employer for 11 years, and she'd told me more than once that she wasn't in any hurry for me to retire. Neither was I. The work kept my mind sharp, kept me dressed and out of the house, kept me connected to something larger than the four walls I came home to each night. I didn't need the money the way I once had, but I needed the purpose. At 75, purpose is not a luxury. It is medicine. My son Derek was 51, lived across town with his wife Cynthia and their teenage son Brandon. On paper, we had a decent relationship. Sunday dinners every few weeks, occasional phone calls. He'd fix things around the house when I asked. A leaky faucet, a stuck storm window. But there was always something underneath Derek's helpfulness that made me uneasy, like a floorboard that holds your weight but sounds wrong when you step on it. He had a way of reframing generosity as management. His help always came with an opinion attached. It started small. The previous October, he'd visited on a Sunday and watched me back the Buick out of the driveway. When I came inside, he was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. "Mom," he said, "you took that turn pretty wide." I had not taken the turn wide. I told him so. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're wrong. "I'm just saying, statistically, accidents go up after 70. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and changed the subject. By February, the comments had become a pattern. Did I really need to drive to the grocery store alone? Had I thought about those senior shuttle services? Didn't I get tired behind the wheel on longer trips? Each question was wrapped in concern, delivered in a gentle voice, but I could hear what was underneath it. He wasn't worried about my safety. He was building a case. Cynthia joined the chorus in March. She called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She typically let Derek handle contact with me, and spent 20 minutes explaining that her own mother had given up driving at 72 and found it so freeing. I thanked her and hung up with a cold feeling in my chest that I couldn't quite name. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, every piece was there. But you don't expect your own child to move against you. That's not cynicism. It's just the basic faith that holds families together. I had that faith. I held it longer than I should have. The day it happened was a Wednesday in April. I worked my usual shift, 8 to 2, then stopped at the pharmacy on the way home for a prescription refill and a small bottle of hand lotion. Nothing remarkable. When I turned onto my street just before 3 in the afternoon, the sun was bright and the neighborhood was quiet. I pulled into my driveway on instinct, already mentally planning dinner, and then I stopped. The driveway was empty. I sat in. No, that's the wrong sentence. I wasn't in any car. I had taken a taxi that morning because the Buick had been making a small noise I wanted a mechanic to check. I'd called Derek the week before, asked if he knew a reliable shop, and he had offered to handle it for me. He said he'd pick the car up Tuesday morning while I was at work and have it looked at. He had the spare key. I had handed it to him myself over the kitchen table because I trusted him. I walked up the porch steps and stood there looking at the empty slab of concrete. The Buick was gone. Derek's phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again, voicemail. I went inside, set my purse on the counter, and sat down at the kitchen table in my coat. The house was very quiet. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe the repairs were taking longer than expected. Maybe he forgot to call. I sat with those maybes for 45 minutes before I admitted to myself, in the specific way that women my age learn to admit things, quietly, without theater, that something was very wrong. I didn't panic. Panic at my age is a young person's luxury. Instead, I made tea, sat back down at the table, and began making calls. Derek didn't answer. Cynthia didn't answer. I tried Brandon, my grandson, who picked up on the second ring and then immediately said, "Grandma, hold on. Dad told me not to," and hung up. That was when my stomach dropped. I called my neighbor Dorothy Simmons, who is 73 and sharp as a tack, and asked her if she'd seen anything unusual in my driveway the day before. Dorothy said yes, actually. Tuesday morning, a man she didn't recognize had come with a flatbed truck and loaded up the Buick. She'd assumed I was having it towed for service. There was a woman with him, she said slowly. Reddish hair. Drove a white Camry. Cynthia drives a white Camry. Cynthia has reddish hair. I put the phone down and sat with that for a long moment. Then I remembered the envelope. 3 weeks earlier, I had withdrawn $50,000 in cash from my savings account. This wasn't impulsive. I had been consolidating money from a CD that matured, and I hadn't yet decided where to move it. My financial advisor was on vacation, and the sum had been sitting in an envelope in the glove compartment of the Buick. I realize now how that sounds, but I had kept cash in my car for short periods before when moving money between accounts, and I'd never had reason to think twice about it. The Buick sat in my locked garage at night. Nobody knew about the envelope. Nobody was supposed to. I closed my eyes and thought, $50,000 gone with the car. I thought I might be sick. I sat very still until the feeling passed. The next morning, Thursday, I contacted the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles through their online portal and requested information on my vehicle's title status. By afternoon, I had an answer that confirmed what I already knew in my bones. The Buick had been transferred to a new owner on Tuesday afternoon. The sale was recorded. The title had been signed. My name appeared on the seller's line. I had not signed anything. I sat at my kitchen table with that document printed out in front of me, and I felt something shift inside me. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder and more useful. Clarity. I was trying to figure out my next move when my cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. Is this Margaret Holloway? The voice was a man's, calm, middle-aged. It is, I said. My name is Ronald Baxter. I think I need to tell you something. I bought a car on Tuesday, a Buick Enclave, from a man named Derek Holloway. He said you were his mother and that you wanted to sell. A pause. I found something in the glove compartment. An envelope. Ma'am, there's a lot of cash in here. The room seemed to narrow and then expand again. How much? I asked, though I already knew. I counted it twice, Ronald said, $50,000. I closed my eyes. Mr. Baxter, I said, thank you for calling me. A lesser person would not have. I meant it absolutely. I didn't feel right keeping it, he said. It's not mine. What do you want me to do? I looked out the window at the empty driveway. I thought about Derek's voice the past 6 months. The careful, patient voice of someone who had been planning something. I thought about Cynthia's Tuesday morning flatbed truck. I thought about my signature on a title I had never touched. Then I thought, what do I actually need from this man? Mr. Baxter, I said slowly, I'm going to ask you to keep that money. Silence on the line. Not permanently, I added, and not without something in return. I need you to do one thing for me. If you're willing, I'd like to explain. He listened. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, Mrs. Holloway, I think I understand, and I'll do it. When I hung up the phone, I had the first piece of a plan. It was modest. Just an outline, really. But an outline is enough to begin. I had been a bookkeeper for 4 decades. I understood that every number eventually balances. Every discrepancy eventually surfaces. And the person holding the ledger holds the power. Derek had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He thought I was finished. I had barely started. Friday morning, I put on my good navy blazer, the one I wore to Gerald's retirement dinner in 2003, the one that still fits. And I drove to the office of Patricia Mercer, an elder law attorney whose name Dorothy had given me 2 years ago, just in case. I had put the card in my address book and hoped I'd never need it. I needed it now. Patricia Mercer was a compact woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel your time was being taken seriously. I sat across from her desk and laid out everything in order. The spare key I'd given Derek, the trip to the mechanic that never happened, the title transfer I hadn't authorized, Ronald Baxter's phone call, the $50,000. I placed the printed title transfer document on her desk. She studied it for a long moment. Mrs. Holloway, she said, have you signed any power of attorney documents giving your son authority over your property? Absolutely not, I said. Good. She tapped the document. This is your signature line, but you say you didn't sign it. I know my own signature, I said. That isn't it. She nodded once, made a note. Then what you're describing is potentially criminal fraud. Title forgery is a felony in Ohio. The unauthorized sale of your vehicle is theft. The value, $35,000 retained by your son, puts this squarely in grand theft territory. She looked up. Do you want to pursue this? That's why I'm here, I said. She laid out the path clearly. First, we'd request a certified copy of the title transfer from the BMV to have the signature formally examined. Second, we'd document the financial loss. Third, if I wanted criminal charges, and she was clear that was my choice, not hers, I would need to file a police report. She also recommended I contact my bank to document the cash withdrawal, establishing that the $50,000 existed and was mine. Ronald Baxter's testimony, she said, would be important. He's cooperative, I told her. Good. She leaned back slightly. I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Holloway. These cases, when they involve family members, become complicated emotionally. Are you prepared for that? I raised Derek, I said. I know exactly who he is. I've been preparing for 40 years. She almost smiled. We shook hands, and I left her office at 11:15 in the morning, feeling more like myself than I had in days. I spent the afternoon at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down dates, times, and details. Everything I could remember about the past 6 months. Every comment Derek had made about my driving, every question about whether I'd thought about simplifying, every moment that now read differently in hindsight. I wrote about the Sunday in October, the Tuesday phone calls in March, Brandon's panicked hang-up. I wrote it all down in the careful, methodical way I had once maintained accounts. A record is only as good as its precision. What I didn't know was that while I was writing, Derek was getting nervous. He called Saturday morning, the first call in 4 days. His voice was easy and casual, which told me immediately he had a script. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you feeling?" I said I was fine. He asked if everything was okay with the house. I said yes. Then he said, "I'm still working on finding the right buyer for sorting out the car situation. It's taking a little longer than expected." He was testing me. He wanted to know if I'd noticed, if I'd acted. "Take your time," I said pleasantly. "No rush." When I hung up, my hand was steady. I had learned something. He hadn't yet realized I'd gone to an attorney. He thought I was still the woman who would wait by the phone and hope for the best. The idea that I might do something, that I might already be doing something, hadn't occurred to him. That was his second mistake. On Monday of the following week, Patricia Mercer's office called with news. The BMV had provided the certified title document. She had sent it to a forensic document examiner she worked with regularly. His preliminary assessment came back by end of day. The signature on the seller's line was not consistent with a natural signing motion. There were signs of tracing. In his professional opinion, the signature had been copied from another document, most likely my bank signature card or a check. I sat at my kitchen table and read the examiner's notes twice. It was the first hard proof, the kind that doesn't bend. I thought of Derek standing in my kitchen last October, arms crossed, watching me back out of the driveway. I thought of his patient, reasonable voice telling me that, statistically, accidents go up after 70. I thought, "You have no idea what's coming." I filed the police report on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the Buick had been taken from my driveway. The Dayton Police Department's non-emergency office was a beige waiting room with plastic chairs and a low hum from fluorescent lights overhead. I had brought my documentation in a manila folder: the title transfer, the forensic examiner's preliminary report, my bank records showing the $50,000 withdrawal, and a 2-page written timeline I had prepared on my legal pad and then typed up cleanly the night before. A young officer named Reyes took my statement. He was thorough and polite, and he didn't once speak to me in the slightly elevated, over-enunciated voice that some younger people use with the elderly. I appreciated that more than I could say. When I described the forged signature, he leaned forward. "You have documentation of that?" I placed the forensic examiner's report on the desk. He read it in silence, then looked up. "Mrs. Holloway, I want to make sure I understand. You believe your son sold your vehicle without authorization and forged your signature on the title transfer?" "I don't believe it," I said. "I can demonstrate it." He made several notes. He told me a detective would follow up within a few days and that the case would be reviewed by the prosecutor's office for potential charges. He gave me a case number. I wrote it in the back of my address book, next to Patricia Mercer's contact information. I was home by noon. I made a sandwich and sat on the back porch in the thin April sunshine. The beets were starting to come up along the garden edge, just the first inch of green. Gerald had never liked beets. I grew them anyway, every year, just because I could. Derek found out by Thursday. I don't know exactly how. Whether Brandon overheard a phone call, whether someone at the BMV knew someone, or whether Derek had, as I suspect, been quietly monitoring things through back channels I wasn't aware of. However it happened, he arrived at my front door Thursday evening at 6:30 with Cynthia behind him, and his face was a color I had never seen on it before. Not red, something darker. Controlled fury, the kind that has been rehearsed. "You filed a police report," he said, not a question. I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said, "if you want to talk." They came in. Derek didn't sit. He stood in the center of my living room with his hands at his sides and said, very quietly, "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" This is your own family, Mom. This is your son. I'm aware, I said. Cynthia put her hand on his arm, a practiced gesture. Then she looked at me with an expression that was meant to appear sad. Margaret, we're worried about you. We've been worried for a long time. The cash kept in your car, the erratic decisions. We just think maybe you need some support that we're not able to provide at home. I recognized the shape of what she was saying immediately. Are you threatening to pursue guardianship? I asked. Neither of them answered, which was its own answer. Because if you are, I continued, I suggest you speak with an attorney before you proceed. I have already spoken with mine. I have a forensic document examiner's report, a police case number, and a bank record establishing that $50,000 in cash was in that vehicle when your husband sold it. Guardianship proceedings require demonstrating cognitive incapacity. I have a full evaluation from my physician from January showing no such impairment. I had, in fact, requested that document from Dr. Okafor's office the previous week, just for this moment. Derek stared at me. Something moved across his face. Something he tried to suppress. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made very few in my life, I said. I don't intend to start now. They left without another word. I stood at my front window and watched their car pull away, and I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds of fear. Because the fear was real, and I am not a woman who pretends otherwise. And then I put it away. The next morning, I called Patricia Mercer's office, left a message describing the visit, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Dorothy and asked her if she wanted to take a small trip. Just 2 nights. We drove down to Cincinnati, stayed in a pleasant hotel, visited the botanical garden, ate at a Thai restaurant Dorothy had read about, and slept 9 hours each night. When I came back, I was ready. The gifts started the week after Cincinnati. First came flowers. A large arrangement of yellow roses left on my porch on a Monday morning, with a card that read, in Cynthia's handwriting, "Thinking of you, Mom. Let's find a way through this together." I put the roses in water because they were roses and had done nothing wrong, but I did not call to say thank you. 3 days later, Derek dropped by in the early afternoon, unannounced. He stood in the doorway with a paper bag from a bakery I used to love. Crumb coffee cake, the kind Gerald and I used to buy on Saturday mornings. And he looked, for a moment, almost like the boy he used to be. Almost. But I was no longer reading his surface. I was reading the pattern. I just wanted to check in, he said. I've been thinking about everything and Mom, I don't want this to turn into something ugly. I don't think either of us wants that. What do you want, Derek? I asked. He shifted the bag in his hands. I want to figure out a way to handle this privately. As a family. I made a bad decision. I know that. But if we could just sit down and talk, I think we could come to an understanding without getting courts involved. Without getting courts involved, there it was. Derek, I said, if you had come to me 3 weeks ago before any of this and said, Mom, I'm in financial trouble and I need help, I would have helped you. You know that. I watched that land on him. But that's not what you did. He opened his mouth and I raised one hand, not dramatically, just firmly. I'm not going to discuss the legal matter with you without my attorney present. That's not negotiable. If you want to speak to me as my son, I'm here. But I am not going to make any agreements that affect a pending legal case. Not over coffee cake. He left the coffee cake on the porch table. I let it sit there until the birds found it. After he left, I sat in my reading chair for a long time. The attempted reconciliation, and I say attempted because it was precisely that, an attempt, nothing more, rattled me less than I expected. But it did underscore something I already understood. I could not go through this alone, not because I wasn't strong enough, but because isolation is its own vulnerability. I needed people who knew the full story and were squarely in my corner. Dorothy already knew most of it. She'd been there from the beginning, and she had the good quality of listening without needing to advise. I told her everything over tea that Thursday. The attorney, the police report, what Derek and Cynthia had said about guardianship, the flowers, the coffee cake visit. She listened until I finished. Then she set her cup down and said, "Maggie, you know I'm here. Whatever you need." That was enough. But I also needed Pamela. My daughter Pamela, who is 47 and lives in Asheville, North Carolina, where she teaches middle school art and raises 2 teenage daughters. Pamela and Derek have never been particularly close. There is a 4-year gap and a temperamental gulf between them, and she had always had a clearer eye for Derek's behavior than I did. Possibly because she wasn't protecting it. I called her on a Sunday evening. I told her everything from the beginning. There was a long silence when I finished, and then she said, in a very quiet voice, "Mom, I've been waiting for something like this." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, I've seen Derek work up to things for years. The way he talks about your house, the jokes about whether you'd thought about downsizing." Another pause. "I didn't know it would go this far. I'm so sorry I didn't say something sooner." "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. She drove up the following weekend. She slept in the guest room, helped me organize my documents, and sat across from Patricia Mercer on Monday morning with a notepad and sharper questions than I would have thought to ask. She was not in the case. It wasn't hers to be in. But she was a witness to my clarity. Sometimes that's what you need. Not someone to fight for you. Someone to confirm that you are not imagining things. That you are not the confused old woman the opposition is trying to make you. I was not confused. I was building. They came on a Saturday morning in early May, when the neighborhood was bright and Pamela had already gone back to Asheville. I saw Derek's car from the kitchen window. That dark blue sedan he'd bought 2 years ago, the one he'd asked me to co-sign for and I'd declined, pulling up to the curb. Cynthia was in the passenger seat. Neither of them had called ahead, which told me this visit had been planned carefully, and they didn't want me to have time to prepare. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, straightened my blouse, and answered the door before they knocked. "Good morning," I said. Derek was dressed more carefully than usual. Collared shirt, not a weekend shirt. Cynthia was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. A casserole dish. As if food was a form of argument. "We wanted to see you," Derek said. His voice was warm, reasonable, the voice I used to trust without question. No agenda, just family. I held the door open and let them come in. We sat in the living room. Cynthia put the casserole in the kitchen without being asked, which meant she had been in this house enough times to move through it with ownership. I noticed that. I sat in my reading chair. They sat together on the sofa, close, coordinated. The way people sit when they have rehearsed this. Derek started with memory. A gentle, meandering story about a family vacation when he was 9, a rented cabin in Michigan, Gerald teaching him to fish. It was a true story. It was also a strategy. Anchor me to warmth, to the past, to the version of us that existed before lawyers and case numbers. I listened without expression. I had spent 50 years reading rooms. This one was not difficult. Then he shifted. "Mom, I need you to hear me." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of sincerity. "I made a serious error in judgment. I should have come to you first. I know that. But the idea of watching you drive every day, getting that call, the kind of call nobody wants to get, it was coming from fear, not greed." Cynthia nodded along. "We love you, Margaret. We only want what's best for you." "And what's best for me?" I asked. My voice was pleasant. Derek's eyes met mine. "Dropping this legal business. before it destroys the family, before it becomes something none of us can take back. There it was, beneath the casserole in the cabin story. It's already something we can't take back, I said. You made sure of that when you forged my signature. A muscle in Derek's jaw tightened. Cynthia set her cup down with a small click that was just slightly too deliberate. We could make you comfortable, Cynthia said, pivoting smoothly. We've talked about this. If you'd be willing to meet us halfway, to consider a private settlement, we could ensure you were taken care of, financially. You wouldn't have to work anymore. You wouldn't have to worry. I looked at her carefully. She was using the word comfortable the way someone uses a pillow when they intend to smother you with it. I don't worry, I said, and I like my job. Margaret. She leaned forward now, too, her voice dropping to something softer, almost intimate. The tone women use when they want you to feel that honesty is being exchanged. I know this feels like we're against you. We're not. We're trying to protect you from a process that will be exhausting and public and painful. You've worked your whole life. You deserve peace, not a courtroom. Peace. Isn't it something? How often people offer you peace as a substitute for justice? Derek's patience thinned. I could see it, the way you can see weather change through glass. Do you understand what's going to happen if this goes to trial? It'll be in the papers. Your name, our name. Brandon will be humiliated. His college applications. Brandon's college applications are not my responsibility, I said. They're yours. You should have thought about Brandon when you were standing at the title office. The room went quiet. Derek stood up. You're being selfish, he said, and his voice had lost its warmth entirely. You're choosing a lawsuit over your own family. I looked up at him from my reading chair. This man I had raised, fed, driven to school for 12 years, sat beside in the hospital when he had his appendix out at 14, watched graduate, helped when his first marriage fell apart. And I felt something I had not expected to feel. Pity. Not for what was happening to him, for what he had made of himself. I'm choosing myself, I said. I don't think I've done that enough. Cynthia pulled at his arm. They were at the door in 30 seconds. Derek turned back once. You're going to regret this. He said it like a promise. I locked the door after them. Then I stood in my front hallway for a moment with my hand still on the deadbolt, and I let myself feel what I felt. A cold, specific fear. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits behind your ribs and tells you this person who once held your hand in a hospital has become capable of something you don't fully have words for yet. I thought about all the ways a determined adult child can make a parent's life difficult. Legal maneuvering, false wellness checks, pressure on doctors, whispering campaigns among mutual friends. I had seen it happen to other women. I knew it was not imaginary. But fear has two functions. It can stop you, or it can sharpen you. I went to the kitchen, set Cynthia's casserole dish on the counter, covered it again, and put it in the refrigerator. Then I sat down and called Patricia Mercer's emergency line and left a detailed message about the visit. I described the specific language used about guardianship and the private settlement offer. I described Derek's final words at the door. I left nothing out. Then I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, took it to the back porch, and sat until the evening birds started up in the hydrangea hedge. The garden smelled like late spring and wet soil. The beets were coming in strong. I was not going to be moved. They would have to understand that eventually. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in June, 3 days after Pamela drove back up from Asheville and moved into the guest room again without being asked. I wore the navy blazer. I also wore Gerald's watch, a simple gold-toned Seiko he'd bought himself in 1987 and worn every day until he died. I don't know exactly why I put it on that morning. I think I wanted him nearby. The Montgomery County Courthouse is a gray stone building on West 3rd Street with a broad front staircase and heavy doors that make a sound when they close, like a decision being finalized. I had driven past it hundreds of times in 30 years of living in Dayton, and never once expected to walk into it as a complainant against my own son. The thought crossed my mind on the front steps, and I let it cross without stopping it. Some thoughts deserve a moment of acknowledgement before you set them aside. Patricia Mercer met me in the lobby at 8:30. She had the full documentation file, forensic report, BMV records, bank statements, the police report, and the written timeline I had prepared, organized into tabbed sections. She reviewed the morning's sequence with me briskly. The hearing would establish the record. Detective Yuen, who had taken over my case from Officer Reyes, would present the investigative findings. The forensic document examiner, a man named Charles Ashby, would offer his expert opinion on the signature. And then there was Ronald. I had spoken to Ronald Baxter twice since our first phone call, once to explain what I needed from him, and once the previous week when he called to confirm he'd follow through. He was a retired high school principal from Kettering. He'd bought the Buick as a second car for his wife. He said he'd been bothered by the whole thing since Tuesday and was glad, genuinely glad, to help set it right. In the weeks between our first call and the hearing, I had thought about Ronald Baxter more than once and wondered what it said about the world, about luck, about randomness, that my $50,000 had landed in the glove compartment of a man with a conscience. It could just as easily have been someone else. That thought kept me humble. What I had asked Ronald to do was simple. I asked him to save everything. The text messages from Derek arranging the sale, the voicemails, the receipt, and to bring it all to the hearing. I also asked him to bring the $50,000, not because I needed it as evidence. Patricia had told me clearly that the money could be transferred through proper legal channels, but I wanted Derek to see it. I wanted him to look at that envelope and know in his body that the thing he thought had vanished had not vanished, that nothing had vanished, that every action leaves a residue, every assumption has a cost. I had been a bookkeeper long enough to understand that the books always, eventually, close correctly. Ronald arrived at 9:15 in a gray jacket, carrying a manila envelope and a canvas tote bag. We shook hands in the corridor. He was taller than I'd imagined from his voice, with an open, steady face. He looked like what he was, an honest man who had stumbled into someone else's family crisis and chosen, without any obligation, to do the right thing. I thanked him again, and he waved it off with the particular discomfort of people who are unused to being thanked for doing what seems obvious to them. Derek and Cynthia arrived together. Derek's attorney, a man I didn't recognize, young and somewhat harried-looking, spoke with Patricia briefly before proceedings began. Cynthia sat in the gallery. She was dressed carefully, her expression composed into something between concern and dignity. I recognized the expression. She'd worn it the day she carried the casserole dish into my kitchen. Derek himself didn't look at me. He sat at his table and studied the grain of the wood. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he had convinced himself in the month since April that there was still a version of this where he walked away cleanly. People are capable of extraordinary self-persuasion. Derek had always been better at it than most. When the hearing was called to order, Judge Caroline Webb, a woman of perhaps 60 with reading glasses on a chain, reviewed the case summary quietly and then looked up. She did not perform authority. She simply had it. Detective Yuen presented first. He laid out the timeline of the sale, confirmed the title forgery finding, and noted that Derek Holloway had been interviewed and had initially claimed his mother had given him verbal authorization to sell the vehicle and keep the proceeds for family expenses. He had not produced any written authorization, and the forensic report contradicted the possibility of a legitimate signature. The detective spoke without drama, which made every word land harder. Charles Ashby spoke next, with precision and zero drama. The signature was traced. The source document appeared to be a check from my account, likely a reference point Derek had access to. The analysis was, in Mr. Ashby's word, unambiguous. He answered 2 cross-examination questions from Derek's attorney with the patience of a man who had testified many times before and had never once been shaken by a question he'd already anticipated. Then Ronald was called. He walked to the stand without hurrying. He produced the text messages, 17 of them between himself and Derek, negotiating the sale price, discussing payment method, Derek assuring Ronald that his mother was fully on board with the transaction and that the car was being sold at her request. He produced the receipt, and then he reached into the canvas tote and placed the envelope on the railing in front of Judge Webb. $50,000 in cash, he said, found in the glove compartment of the vehicle. I documented it with photographs before touching it. I called Mrs. Holloway the same day I found it. The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could feel Patricia Mercer's stillness beside me, the specific stillness of an attorney who knows the moment has arrived. Derek's attorney leaned toward him. I couldn't hear what he said. I could see Derek's face. He hadn't known about Ronald's text messages. That was clear. He'd assumed, and I imagine this assumption had felt safe to him, that the private buyer of a private sale vehicle was a stranger who would have no connection to the aftermath. He hadn't considered that this particular stranger would answer the phone when I called. He hadn't considered that honesty still existed in the world in the shape of a retired principal from Kettering who couldn't sleep with $50,000 in his hall closet. That was his third mistake. And in my experience, it is always the third mistake that finishes things. Then Derek did something his attorney very much did not want him to do. He stood up. This is being completely mischaracterized, he said. His voice was loud and slightly unsteady, the voice of someone whose script has just run out. My mother is elderly. She doesn't understand what's happening with her own finances. This was done for her protection. Mr. Holloway, Judge Webb's voice was flat and absolute. Sit down. He sat, but his face was open now in a way it had never been in my kitchen or living room, uncontrolled, exposed. The careful, patient man who had spent 6 months managing me with reasonable voices and gentle implications was gone. What was left was someone smaller and more frightened and much less certain. Cynthia had her hand on his arm again, but this time she was not guiding him. She was gripping, her knuckles pale, her composed expression beginning to show its seams. I sat at the complainant's table with my hands folded and looked at the judge. I did not look at my son. I had nothing left to prove to him, and I was not going to spend this moment, this particular, hard-won moment, looking backward. I had spent 40 years keeping books. I knew what a settled account looked like. This was it. The weeks that followed the hearing moved with the particular slowness of legal processes, but they moved in one direction only. The Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office filed charges against Derek Michael Holloway in late June. 1 count of felony theft, 1 count of title fraud, and 1 count of forgery. Each of these offenses carrying a potential sentence under Ohio Revised Code that Derek's harried young attorney explained to him in terms that, according to Pamela, who heard through Brandon, drained the color from Derek's face. I did not take particular satisfaction in hearing that. What I felt was closer to relief. The specific relief of watching a thing you already knew become a thing that was officially, undeniably, publicly known. Cynthia was not charged separately. Her direct criminal involvement was harder to establish beyond reasonable doubt. But Patricia Mercer had simultaneously filed a civil action against both of them for the $35,000 in proceeds from the vehicle's sale. The civil threshold of proof is lower than criminal, and what we had was more than sufficient. The text messages between Derek and Ronald, Derek's own statement to police that he'd sold the car and used the proceeds for family expenses, and Dorothy's eyewitness testimony placing Cynthia at the scene with the flatbed truck on Tuesday morning combined to produce something Derek's attorney ultimately told him was not survivable at trial. Dorothy, I should say, had been absolutely willing to testify. She had dressed carefully for her deposition, her good blue cardigan, pearl earrings, and she had answered every question with the clear, unhurried certainty of a woman who had seen what she'd seen and had no reason in the world to embellish it. He took a plea in August, the kind of hot, still Ohio August where the air barely moves and the whole city seems to be waiting. Derek appeared in court again and entered a guilty plea on the felony theft charge. The forgery charge was reduced as part of the agreement. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory restitution, and 200 hours of community service. The restitution order was clear and enforceable: $35,000 to be repaid to Margaret Elaine Holloway in full with a structured payment schedule. Any default would trigger an automatic hearing before the judge. His probation officer would supervise compliance. He would not go to prison. I had not asked for prison. That is a thing people sometimes found surprising when I told them. Why not push for the maximum? Why allow a plea? But I had never wanted to destroy Derek. I had wanted to stop him. I had wanted a record to exist that could not be revised or minimized or explained away at future family gatherings. A guilty plea on felony theft is a permanent record. It follows a person through background checks, professional licensing, financial applications. It is not nothing. It is, in practical terms, a very great deal. I had wanted him to stop, to be stopped, since he would not stop himself. That happened. I let it be enough. The civil case against both Derek and Cynthia was settled in September. They signed an agreement that included an admission of civil liability for the unauthorized sale and payment of my legal fees, which were not insignificant and which I had been prepared to absorb but was glad not to. Patricia Mercer sent me the final documents on a Friday afternoon with a short handwritten note clipped to the front. You were a pleasure to represent. I put the note in the small box I keep on my dresser where I keep things worth keeping. It sits there now, next to a photograph of Gerald and a shell Pamela brought me from the Carolina coast years ago. Ronald Baxter transferred the $50,000 back to me through proper legal channels, as Patricia had arranged, formally, cleanly, with documentation, the way things should be done. I wrote Ronald a letter afterward, an actual letter, on cream stationery with a fountain pen I hadn't used in years, and told him that his honesty had made the difference between a loss I could survive and a justice I could live with. I told him I thought of him as evidence that the world was not entirely what cynics said it was. He sent back a short, handwritten reply. Anyone decent would have done the same. I disagree. But I kept the letter. Pamela was there for the settlement signing. She drove up from Asheville for the second time that summer, and we went to dinner afterward at a place she'd found downtown. Good fried chicken, genuine sweet tea, red check tablecloths, the kind of restaurant where the noise is friendly and nobody hurries you. We sat across from each other in a corner booth, and she raised her glass of iced tea and said, simply and quietly, "To you, Mom." I raised mine. "To Gerald," I said. Who knew how to pick people? She laughed, and so did I, and it was the first time in months that laughter felt entirely unguarded, not performed, not careful, just laughter. There was one more thing. After everything was settled, after the signed orders and the restored money and the guilty plea and the civil judgment, I contacted Ronald and arranged to buy the Buick back. He had offered this almost immediately after the case resolved, at the original sale price, no markup. He'd bought a different car for his wife in the meantime and said, and I believed him, that the Buick belonged back where it came from. I drove it home from Ronald's house in Kettering on a clear September afternoon. Windows down, the radio on the oldies station Gerald used to keep it on. The light was the particular amber of Ohio September, the kind that makes ordinary streets look briefly like paintings. The road was completely open ahead of me. At 75 behind the wheel, with nowhere I had to be and nothing left to prove, I thought about Derek saying at 75, "You don't belong behind the wheel." I thought about how certain he had been, how thoroughly, serenely certain. The way people are certain about things they have never examined. I drove home. I parked in my driveway. I sat for a moment with my hands in my lap and the engine off. Then I went inside and made dinner. The fall that year was extraordinary. Dorothy and I drove up to see the leaf color in Hocking Hills in October, a trip we'd been talking about for 3 years without ever going. We stayed in a small inn near a state park, ate soup by a wood fire, and walked trails at our own pace without explaining ourselves to anyone. I took more photographs in those 2 days than I had in the previous 5 years. Pamela came for Thanksgiving. Her daughters, Rosie, 16, and Claire, 13, filled the house with noise and energy that reminded me what a house can be when it's alive. We cooked together, all 4 of us in the kitchen, and made Gerald's mother's cornbread dressing, which requires patience and is absolutely worth it. I slept well that week, not the thin, anxious sleep I'd had through the spring and summer. Real sleep, deep and restoring. I went back to work at Dr. Hess's office with a clarity I hadn't expected. Patricia Hess, who had known something was wrong but had given me space through the spring, asked quietly how things were, and I told her the short version. She put her hand over mine and said, "Good for you, Margaret. Good for you." I was touched by how much I meant it when I said thank you. I also made a practical decision that had been overdue. I sat down with my financial advisor. Margaret put her house in proper order through an updated will, a durable power of attorney, assigned to Pamela, not Derek, and a healthcare directive. I had not been careless before, but the events of the spring had shown me that clarity on paper, the kind that cannot be misread or manipulated, was a form of protection. I completed it all before Christmas. As for Derek and Cynthia, I won't pretend I tracked their lives obsessively. I didn't have to. Small cities tell small stories, and Dayton is, at heart, a small city. The restitution payments began in November, as ordered. They were on time because they had to be. Violation of the restitution order carried consequences Derek's attorney had made clear to him. But a structured payment plan drawn from the finances of a household already strained is not an abstraction. It is felt monthly in practical ways. Less money for the things that had made their life look comfortable. Brandon, I heard from Dorothy, who heard from a neighbor, transferred to the community college after 1 semester at the university he'd been accepted to. There may have been other reasons. I didn't know them all. Derek and Cynthia, from what filtered back to me through people who knew us both, stopped attending their church, the one they'd belonged to for 9 years, sometime in the winter. The exact reason was not something I was told, but a guilty plea on felony theft is public record. Communities process information, even when no one says anything directly. I did not feel triumphant about any of that. I want to be precise about this. I did not take satisfaction in Brandon's changed plans or in whatever strain Derek and Cynthia were navigating privately. The satisfaction I felt, and I did feel it, I won't pretend otherwise, was specific. It was the satisfaction of having stood in my own living room and refused to be managed, of having sat in a courtroom and watched the truth hold. That is all I had wanted. I hadn't wanted disaster for Derek. I had wanted him to stop. To be stopped, since he wouldn't stop himself. I saw him once, in late January, at a distance. I was coming out of the pharmacy on Wilmington Avenue, the same one I'd stopped at the day everything began. And he was across the parking lot. He saw me too. We looked at each other for a moment. He didn't wave. Neither did I. He got in his car and left, and I stood there for a moment holding my small paper bag. Then I walked to the Buick and drove home. That evening I made a chicken soup from scratch, the kind that takes all afternoon with real broth. And I ate it at the kitchen table with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. Through the window, I could see the first trace of a winter sunset going pink over the rooftops. I thought about Gerald, who had been gone 11 years and whom I still miss with a consistency that has never become routine. I thought about the beets, which would need to be replanted in the spring. I thought about Dorothy, who'd called that morning just to talk, and about Pamela, who'd texted a photograph of Claire's new painting, blue and yellow and very alive. And I thought, I am 75 years old. I am alone in this house. And there is not a single thing in my life that does not belong to me. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, enormous. I learned that being old does not make you manageable unless you allow it. That love and control are not the same thing, and that a person who confuses the two is telling you exactly who they are. I learned that money kept in a glove compartment can, under the right circumstances, change everything, and that an honest stranger can be more family than family. Most of all, I learned this. When someone decides you are finished, the only answer is to begin. Would you have done what I did, or would you have found a quieter way through? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. And if this story found you at the right moment, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. This was my story. Every word of it was mine.